Can we teach without a lesson plan? That is the very question that Scott Thornbury posited in his 2000 article, A Dogma for EFL. Dogme, apparently it's named after a Danish film movement from 1995, which espoused the following features: that all the features of the movie were going to be produced locally, there's going to be no CGI, special effects, that kind of thing. And that's where Scott's getting at with Dogme ELT. My name's Alistair Grant and welcome to my teacher training channel. Now, I could have started this series of videos off by talking about the history of methods or something of the sort, starting with grammar translation, etc, etc, but I thought no, let's go straight for the jugular here and talk about the singularly most controversial method since the history of methods and approaches. So what is Dogme ELT exactly? Well, the idea behind Dogme is that there is too much reliance on materials in the classroom, things like course books, things like videos, music, etc, etc. In Scott's article from the year 2000, this is what he talked about. But not only is it about that, in fact what Scott did was he talked about what he called the 3 pillars of Dogme ELT. So what are these? Well, those 3 pillars are the following. Every single class has to be conversation driven, materials light, and the only language that is supposed to come up during the class, the only language that's supposed to be taught, let's say, is emergent language. What does that mean? We've probably heard this term before. What is emergent language? So emergent language is the language that the students produce in class, and we as teachers pick up on that and decide to work with it, rather than prescribing what is going to happen in the classroom. Now, these 3 pillars, as they were called, were later revised to be known as the 3 tent poles. Why the 3 tent poles? Well, the idea of that is that they could be used anywhere and at any time in any classroom. In fact, all a teacher needs to do is have those tools, as it were, those tent poles, let's call them, at their disposal, and they will be able to teach a class. Why is that? Well, let's examine this a little bit. I don't know whether you've ever found this, but I certainly, when I started teaching, thought, how can I do this without a course book? For goodness sake, this is going to be impossible to teach a class without a syllabus and without a course book. So I was grateful for the existence of the course book at the time. Scott says, let's do away with all that kind of thing. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that he's anti-course book per se. It's not that he's anti-materials per se. That's not the idea. The idea is we strip down the teaching to the bare necessities. So what does that mean? What we need to do is break down those 3 tent poles again. So first of all, we've got it to be conversation driven. What do we do in a classroom? Well, we say to the students, for example, how was your weekend? How did it go? What was the party like last night? And based on the language they produce, that is the lesson's very starting point. How can it be the lesson starting point, Alistair? Well, this is where the whole idea of emergent language comes into play. You ask your students, for example, so how was your weekend? And they tell you. You notice as they are doing so that perhaps they need help with something like the narrative tenses. You have a language input phase of the lesson, and based on that, they can then repeat the task afterwards, but hopefully with upgraded language, as Adrian Underhill once put it. This is why Dogme is also known as teaching unplugged. It's being unplugged from the system, unplugged from all those resources, the embarrassment of riches that Scott Thornbury talked about in his original article. What he said was that underneath a pile of all this, somehow, somewhere, we'd lost the plot. Where was the real communication? Where were the real lives of the students? And that's what Dogme is all about. It's a humanistic approach to teaching as well. Is it a method? Is it an approach? Is it a movement? Well, actually, it's all of those things. And it's really up to you, the teacher, to decide how to action that in class. Because it's not just about what you do in the classroom, as we're going to see right now. You see, Dogme is more than just about the teaching itself. There's also certain prescriptions on the class. For example, there is no lesson plan, hence my dramatic intro to this video. So what is a teacher supposed to do? Well, the teacher's supposed to do what Scott calls post-planning, which is essentially sitting down and reflecting on how the class went. Not only that, imagine a Dogme school. In one of Scott's articles, he talks about just exactly that kind of thing. In a Dogme school, there would be no lesson plans. In fact, there would be no syllabus either. Why not? Well, how can you have a syllabus if all the language is going to be emergent? This is where one of the criticisms of Dogme comes in, which we'll focus on in just a little bit. But not only that, The other thing is that in a dogma school there would be no level system. The stronger students would be helping out the weaker students and vice versa. But can we do this on a class-by-class basis? Can we do it on a course-by-course basis? These are some of the criticisms that have been levelled at Dogma ELT. In fact, Jeremy Harmer once asked, is it not better to have what he called dogma moments in a classroom rather than running an entire course or even an entire lesson like this? So let's talk about this for a second. What red flags are there with Dogma ELT? Well, on the one hand, think about yourself as a novice teacher. Could you do this from the outset? Let's think about this. You've just done a CELTA, you've just graduated, as it were, from Teaching Academy. Could you go straight ahead and go into a classroom without a course book, ask the students about their weekend and just go for it? Maybe you wouldn't feel so comfortable or confident doing that. Maybe you wouldn't feel so comfortable or confident, but does that mean it really can't be done? This is one of the wonderful things about Dogma ELT. Not this is a lesson plan. We're supposed to be going off plan and off grid, as it were, in a Dogma classroom. The idea of all of this being called into question, and why not? It takes revolutionary statements like this sometimes to make us perhaps reflect on what we're doing in the classroom. So I want you to reflect right now. Imagine the following. You're about to walk into the classroom on a Monday afternoon, not having planned a thing, with no material in your hand whatsoever, knowing that whatever happens in the classroom is only going to be a product of your conversation with the students. Now, how do you feel about that? Because there's a couple of options. You could either feel very excited or very, very fearful. Okay, now think about it from the student's point of view. Before they walk into the classroom, they do not know what's going to happen. Are they going to feel excited or fearful? That's up to you to decide. Personally, I'm not going to influence your decision, although I'd really love to. All I will say is do have a go at Dogma, perhaps even the next time you go into the class. See how the students react, see what happens, and more importantly, see how you feel as their teacher. So what other possible criticisms of Dogma ELT could there be? Well, on the one hand, there is the possibility that students don't actually want to have a conversation-driven class. Maybe they don't even want to talk particularly. I, for example, have had classes where I've had business English students. They've come back from a day of long working hours and they didn't necessarily want to sit in the classroom and talk about anything. They wanted it to be teacher-led. They didn't want it to be student-led. So how would Scott respond to something like that? Well, look no further, because in the link below you will find an interview with Scott Thornbury. That's myself interviewing Scott, and I asked him exactly the same question. And you will see from the Wikipedia page, which I in fact edit, he said the following: that perhaps what they should have said when talking about Dogma ELT in the first place was that it should be text-driven rather than conversation-driven. Why is that? Well, there may be people who don't necessarily want to talk in the classroom. Now, those texts could be spoken text or written text, but the idea is perhaps it should be text-driven rather than conversation-driven. So why the change? Well, apart from the fact that there might be students in the classroom who aren't particularly interested in chatting away for whatever reason, perfectly legitimate, it's also the case that all human communication is now encoded within either a writing system or a speaking system. And the fact is that this is the idea of text. It's something that is interwoven. I think it in fact comes from the Latin word textere, which means to weave. And this, I think, is where Scott Thornbury is coming from. If we study those texts, if we study those encodings of knowledge, be they spoken or written, we get a clue not only to another language, but it opens a door on a different culture as well. And I think this is where Dogma is coming from. You're feeling like you are entering within a culture rather than simply learning how to order food in a cafe. So it's been a pleasure to spend this time with you today, me and my extinct now lesson plan, and just you and me, just like how it would be in a Dogma classroom. Please do write in the comments what you think about the idea of Dogma ELT. I will see you next time when we'll be talking about different methods and approaches. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye for now. Take care.